We're going over the day when God's goodness overtakes evil. So here's my goal. I have a goal with this whole sermon series. When you look at this tag, I want you to stop thinking of when God's goodness overtakes evil, like evil outside, but when God's goodness overtakes evil, evil from here. Evil from here. And some of you are like, yeah, right, that evil pastor, right? No. We're all pointing in. We're all pointing in. Like that's my goal in this, because we're talking about the great and glorious day of the Lord. So I want to say something right off the top that is interesting, and one of the things that kind of spurred this whole sermon series on the great and glorious day of the Lord. It's when I was reading about this story, because you guys know how I feel about Genesis, and especially the first part of Genesis. I love it. And I was reading this, and the Tower of Babel, the name there, it's another word in Hebrew that's very similar to it, and it's Babylon. That's when I realized that Hebrew word, it was, this tower will be called Babylon. It stuck out to me, and the day of the Lord meant something entirely different to me then. And just have that in the back of your mind as we talk. Because sometimes we look at the Tower of Babel and it's about other things that it's not really about. And so we're going to get into that, but what we're going to be doing is talking in this whole sermon series, we're going to be talking about Day of the Lord events all through there and what God is doing in these Day of the Lord events. So if I say to you, what do you think of when you think of the great and glorious Day of the Lord? What comes to your mind? Resurrection. Oh, the resurrection. See, you guys are better people than me. Like, I don't know, I grew up in Georgia. Even though I grew up in a Missouri Synod household, just growing up in the Atlanta area, you automatically grow up half Baptist. It's just what happens. That's just the way of the thing. So that half Baptist side of me, whenever I hear the great and glorious day of the Lord, I automatically go to pictures of this, of fire and brimstone and all those things right there. So by you guys answering resurrection, you're probably better Lutherans than me, right? So that's, but does anyone think of fire and brimstone, or am I alone in that? Yeah, all right. Cool. I'm going to stop preaching then, because that's the premise behind this whole thing. the great and glorious day of the Lord. No, you're right, because Coley answered it exactly the same way, too, when I asked her. And I was like, this is not the narrative that I need. I need everyone to be incorrect so I can save everyone, right? That's not true. But anyway, I think if you would ask a lot of people, though, there's this idea, again, it's from my half-Baptist self, right? That it's of this huge destruction event, right? And if you're thinking that, it's right. There is right, because as Christians, we kind of think of this great and glorious day of the Lord as what's kind of going to happen way in the future, right? When Jesus comes back. But actually, this is a narrative. The day of the Lord are stories that have happened multiple times throughout the Scripture. The Tower of Babel is one of them. So is the flood. So is Cain and Abel. So is Egypt. The Exodus account. All these things we are going to be talking about in this sermon series, looking at these great and glorious Day of the Lord images. And there are some scary stuff, like brimstone and fire and moon turning to blood and all those things. And it's in there. And the truth of the story of the Day of the Lord is that God is confronting evil. He's going to pour out his justice on all of the creation. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. So I think also there's a sense when we think about this of how God is going to do that, how he's going to dispense justice. And he's just going to come at the day of the Lord and just destroy all of the baddies, right? All of our enemies, put them back where they belong, and we will be victorious, right? And everyone else who's not a Christian will find themselves realizing that they were wrong and we were right the whole time, right? And we can go nanny, nanny, boo-boo to them, right? As they are in the lake of fire, some sense like that. Like that's, I don't know. That's kind of how the story has been told to me, maybe without the nanny, nanny, boo-boos. But it's there. And that's the whole thing, is that when we actually read the scriptures, this account happens a bunch. It happens a bunch. And so we're going to get into some of those. And I don't think that we're even free from Day of the Lord events even to this day. Because as our reading from the New Testament today said, that God kind of lets us over to our own bases and sins a lot of times. So and we can see that our sins can compound on each other. And so let's talk about this, though. Let's talk about this. The first story we're going to talk about is Cain and Abel. You guys are familiar with this story, right? So here's a photograph of the event. We have Cain and Abel is Adam and Eve's son. So we know the story of Genesis. You have the first 2 chapters of Genesis are God creating the whole world and creating humanity in it. And the humanity is kind of the pinnacle of the creation. They are his image bearers. They are his image holders, okay? So they're over there, but there's a problem, and that's Genesis 3. Right? There's a serpent that comes and, serpents, right? There's a serpent that comes and says, hey, would you like this fruit? It will give you the knowledge of what? Good and evil. We have a key point. It'll give you the knowledge of good and evil. And God didn't want them to take that knowledge. We're starting to see that there's a narrative that flows from here, but they eat it. And what happens? Death comes into the world, pain in childbearing. You will work the soil of the ground with your sweat, right? Like it'll be tough and hard and all that stuff. And then we get into Cain and Abel. Now, does anyone understand the Cain and Abel story? Because I don't, right? Like the Cain and Abel story is weird. It's super weird. Like people are like, where did they get their wives from? Like are they just their sisters? Listen, the story doesn't tell us. And my best thing, and I want you to be curious, but this one there's no answer, so just don't worry about it. All right? It's over there because there's tons of ink spilled on this. But the Cain and Abel story is Cain is he's a worker of the ground, and he has a fruitful crop, and he brings that fruitful crop up to God and makes a sacrifice to God with that fruitful crop. And then Abel, his occupation is like sheep and things, herds and all that stuff. And so he has a great fruitful sheep and things herd, and he brings those sheep up and he sacrifices it to God. And which one does God like more? Remember? Abel's, right? Abel's. He likes Abel's more. Why? I don't know. The story's confusing. And tons of ink is spilt on that part of the story. Like, why did God like this sacrifice more? And God likes dead animals more than he likes dead plants or something like that. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'll know as I study more and more. But what I think is interesting is that sometimes we get caught up in the weeds of that first part of the story and we miss the second part, and it actually tells us what's going on in the story. So when you look at the second part, you see in Genesis chapter 4, 6 through 7, Cain, he's realized God liked Abel's sacrifice even better than his. And we pick it up here. And the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will not you be accepted? And if you do not do well," notice, "sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is contrary to you." And what is you? The image of God, right? Remember, the sin is contrary to who you are, and you must rule over it. You must control it, right? But what does Cain do? He kills Abel. He kills Abel. Does he resist the temptation? No, not at all. He falls into it. And we're beginning to see the problem here. That Adam and Eve, they took the knowledge of good and evil and they start defining what is good and what is evil on their own side now. And we're seeing that original sin part right there with Adam and Eve, it is being passed on to their offspring. And now we have Cain, who's also defining what is good and right in his own heart. You see that? And that's the whole idea. And we see that it continues on. Is that you see the very next story after this is the flood. And what's the problem with the flood? Everyone is doing everything that's right in their own eyes, right? Everybody is defining good and evil on their own. They're like, this is good and this is evil. Like, this is just what they're all doing. And God's like, I need to purify all of this with the waters of baptism. With waters of the flood. That was all right. So the waters of the flood. I need to purify all this, but they see Noah and his family. Oh, Noah's a righteous guy. And if we choose Noah here, then we'll be able to purify the world and everything will be better because we found the righteous guy. And so the whole world is washed clean, right? It's purified except for this nice righteous path through Noah. But what happens right after they get off the ark? Some kind of shame happens, right? Have you ever heard anyone say something like this? If we could just get rid of the baddies in the world, that would solve our problems. Maybe they don't say it quite like that. But you've heard that before, right? It's been done before. It's been tried. And your sin is worse than theirs, probably. That's what the flood wants you to get out of it. That the purification of the world, and even through the most righteous one, sin still came through, and it didn't even last a generation. It happened to Noah at the end of it. A lot of times we look at the problems of the world and we go, it's somebody else. But in Lent, and this idea of the day of the Lord is inviting us to go, I'm the problem. I'm the problem. And this is what makes this incredibly difficult. And this is why I need you to put your big girl and boy pants on, and put your big belt on like you're going to work, right? So that's because it's saying that the problem is not someone else, because the story has us getting rid of the others that were causing the problem. And we still have the problem throughout it. And the very next story is the Tower of Babel, right? Very next story is the Tower of Babel. We're just going right through Genesis really fast here. Oh yeah, there's Cain and Abel. Defining good and evil for himself. We already went through that. So we got the Tower of Babel. So the Tower of Babel is, or the Tower of Babylon, if you want to look at it that way. They both work. It's the same word in Hebrew. You just need to understand that. All right. So this is Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. It says, "Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the whole face of the earth.'" This, I think, is kind of the critical area of this story here. But you see that language? Let us make a name for ourselves. Let us make a name for ourselves and build a huge tower. Now, when I was little, like 22 years old, I remember worrying, it's like, oh man, because I lived in Atlanta. There's a lot of tall buildings in Atlanta, right? Over there, it's like, look at all these towers of Babel, right? All these people building their towers to the sky. God is going to smite them, right? And I could never really understand that. That's not what this story is about. This story is not so much about building. So if you build a 2-story house, it's a tower of evil. I mean, maybe it is. I don't know. It depends on why you're building it. But that's not what this is about. It's about running from where God has put you. It's about making a name for yourself. No longer claiming the name of God. No longer claiming His image, but making a name for yourself so that you can stand and have autonomous stuff from God, where you're not even beholden to God. Because have you ever thought about how it raised into the sky? Have you ever thought about what that meant? What that meant, right? It's getting away from where you were created. So some of you have been to an Ash Wednesday service before, I imagine. What do we say in an Ash Wednesday service? From dust you came, dust you will return, right? At least that's what I say. That from dust you came, and to dust you will return. But the whole thing is about you are from dust. Why do we say that? We were created in the dust of the earth. In fact, we were created in the earth, is what it says. We were created out of the creation here, that we were created. And then when they are trying to rise up to get to the same level as God, they're trying to lift themselves up out of the creation so they can be above God. Trying to rise themselves up out of where God has put them and where they can be beholden to no one. Interesting, huh? This is like 6 months of study right now. So they've risen themselves up to be above God Himself. Now, let's ask this question. Let's ask a hard question. How many of us do that? How many of us triumph this idea of rising yourself out of the ashes, right? Like that's how many of us really look forward to this, because it's everywhere. Because we love to make a name for ourselves. It's rare that we are content with just being what God created us. That my name's Chris, I'm God's. I want people to know Chris Escher, the ultimate preacher, right? Come experience his awesome preaching, and we have this massive church and all that stuff, right? We love that. And listen, I've been watching the Olympics lately, as much as I can, because the Olympics are fun. Do you guys watch the Olympics? Yeah. So who is awesome at the long distance speed skating? What country? Korea? Have they been nailing it this year? Normally. It's the orange suits, right? That's Netherlands, right? So the Netherlands, there's a guy named Sven Kramer they are obsessed with him over there. Listen, the Netherlands are not that big, right? They're not that big of a country. He alone, a guy who ice skates. We don't even have ice here. It's all artificial here in Florida, right? It's why all you guys left. Because it stinks up there. That's, some of you are like, it doesn't stink, then why are you down here? It's beautiful down here. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and I said it was 80 degrees today. She goes, I hate you. Now those were her words. But they're going to come and visit us in May. So they're over there, they're ice skating, and this guy has endorsement deals that are worth millions of dollars. I probably would have showed you one of his ads, but they're all in another language that I can't understand. And if I don't understand it, I don't show it, right? Anyway, so he's got endorsement. I bet they get him where he sells chocolate bars. Do you think he eats chocolate bars? No. I eat chocolate bars, right? So like we love it when we can name stuff. We buy products from someone else's name. But you're like, the Dutch, I don't care about the Dutch, right? Like I care about America. So we can pick on some of it in America. What's this brand? Jordan. You guys have all seen this brand before, right? Yeah. Did you hear what the big news about this brand was this year? Well, before we even get into that, because no one heard, good. Well, I'll tell you here in a second. I was 6 years old. 6, all right? That's how long ago this is. And some of you are like, well, you're 12 now. Like that's not 12. I am decidedly middle-aged, all right? So it was 1988. I was 6 when Michael Jordan did that famous dunk that he did where he jumped from the free throw line, the three-point line, and somehow flew through the air like a magician and dunked the ball, right? You guys, have you always seen all that picture of Jordan doing that? That was like 20 some odd years ago. The guy hasn't played basketball for almost 20 years. But we all know what that is. He's made a name for himself. Now, the big news, University of Florida football has announced that their uniforms next year are going to be made by the Jordan brand, a football team. It's not even the basketball. It's football. We're obsessed, right? Like it's this name. Nike is positioning the Jordan brand to become their premium sports brand. And it's all because a guy looked like he flew in the 80s. All right? Like we love this idea. We're like, man, they've got these stories of people making a name for themselves. That's all the Olympics are. Like it's all just people stories and then like 30 seconds of action, right? And then back to another people story. And it makes us feel great. It does. And it is great. I'm not disqualifying how Susie from Nebraska is now like the fastest skier in the world or something like that, you know? Like I'm not disparaging that, even though I kind of am. But we have this Jordan thing, but it speaks to this idea that we love to make a name for ourselves. And we love it, and we deal with it constantly, even in our personal lives. Where maybe you're a young mother or something like that, and you carefully cater your social media experience so that your life looks so much better than it actually is, right? Or maybe the way you work, or you've worked in the past, you worked and you burned the midnight oil all the way to 11:30 at night, almost on a nightly basis, so your boss's boss would know who you are, right? Like we love to make a name for ourselves, or because we're retired in the room, mostly. I don't know if this applies to you guys. Or you work really hard and spend more money on your grandkids so that they would like you better than the other set. Did I get one? Little Jimmy and Annette, you're going to love me more than the other ones. We're going to Disney. And this grandma doesn't live in Nebraska. We live right by it. It's going to be great, right? Like we love to make a name for ourselves. And that's the whole point of this. It's the whole point. This wasn't a struggle back then. It's a struggle that we're going to have when we walk out of this building. It's a struggle you're going to have right now. That we love to make a name for ourselves. And listen, this is incredibly difficult to talk about. Because every being and fiber in us and our culture and everything is against that idea. Everything, success in this country says you will work hard, tirelessly to make a name for yourself. And God is like, well, that's the Tower of Babel, right? Because they want to make a name for themselves, and they didn't want to be scattered. And here's the truth, is that Ash Wednesday and Lent provides us an opportunity to sit back, evaluate our lives, and go, I may need to be scattered. I've worked too hard for me this year. I may need to be scattered, and I may need to be brought back to where I was. Because that's what we see in Jesus. If anything we see the kingdom of God in Jesus constantly. Because he's talking about how the humble are lifted up and the prideful are brought down. Like, this is what we're talking about. And Jesus just epitomized that constantly. Like, when he was in the wilderness, tempted, and like one of the temptations was like, the Satan, the accuser, was telling Jesus, hey, I will give you the world if you just bow down and worship me, right? I will give you everything. And we're all like, way to go, Jesus, you defeated Satan. But we're in, like, if we have the opportunity to squirt in front of someone at the Walmart, to get in front of someone at the checkout lane, we do it. We would sell out our soul to get faster through the checkout lane, right? Some of you are like, no, I never do that. I've seen you. But he didn't do it. And I think if we honestly look at ourselves, it's like, man, I have already sold out my name so it could be made great. So many times. At the expense of others, at the expense of my family. So others could be knocked down, right? Like, Jesus comes in complete humility. He hangs out with the outcast, the lame, the sick, and the despised. And ultimately, he goes to where those in the towers, ourselves, right? He goes to ourselves in the own tower, and he's questioning the powerful in the tower. He's questioning all of that. And everyone in the tower begins to yell in unison, crucify him, crucify him. He's telling us that we're all wrong and terrible and all this stuff. Like, crucify him, get him out of our sight. He needs to be dead and gone. And let's just go ahead and prove our point, and let's put him up on a cross next to two nameless criminals so that everyone would forget him. Those powerful forces inside of me, they want me to make my own name great. Those forces that were yelling, crucify, they want me to make my own name great. And we see that ultimately, on the day of the Lord is the cross event and his resurrection. That ultimately, that is the big one. The big one that was over the board, where we saw that the Lord overtook, that God's goodness overtakes evil. And we see it on the cross. Where it wasn't moons turning to blood and fire and brimstone coming onto all of us, but it all came on to Jesus. And that's how he took it over. And he raises from the dead. He raises from the evil. And have you ever thought about this on Easter? How Jesus raises from the dead? Because it matters in the story. It matters. Does he come from riding in on the clouds from on high? No. He doesn't come from the Tower of Babel. Where does he come from? From the grave. From the common place where we were all created. He came out of there, and he brings life, renewing, recreation to everyone around us when he came out of the common creation. And that's good news. That's good news. Because so often we're trying to save ourselves by trying to make our name great, right? If I can just understand this enough, and if I can just serve enough, if I can just have the just right political views, and I can convince everyone on Facebook of those same political views, then I'll be able to go to the good stuff, right? That was a joke. I'm glad some people are laughing. God rises up out of the grave, out of the ground, out of the tomb, in humbleness, And that's how he brings life. That's how he brings us the kingdom, in just that humble stuff. So sometimes I've built towers to myself, and they may need to crumble, and I may need to be scattered. And on Ash Wednesday and the beginning of Lent, I'm reminded of that. So Christian, those fellow beings that were created by the Most High God, to all of you that struggle with pride and constantly want your name to be great. Notice I'm not saying you, I am, but I'm including us all in that, because I struggle with that too. Be encouraged, for the Lord has taken our evil. He's taken our pride, and he has turned our evil and pride into salvation for us by taking it to the grave and recreating it and bringing righteousness and glory out of it. That's good news. He's taken how we wanted the world to know our names, but instead we know that at the name of Jesus, every knee would bow and every tongue would confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And that's good news.